We'll wait until we have a few more attendees join us, but we'll begin in just a few minutes. This is the student research panel for the colloquium on research in the social sciences and humanities. We'll begin in just a minute. This is the student research panel for the colloquium on research in the social sciences and humanities. We'll begin in just a bit. Good afternoon and welcome to the colloquium on research in the social sciences and humanities student research panel. I'm Erin Force, Associate Dean in Georgetown College and advisor to the College Academic Council. I'd like to give you a little background on the colloquium before introducing today's panel. The colloquium on research in the social sciences and humanities, or CRUSH as we've nicknamed it, has been planned and organized by the College Academic Council since 2017. CRUSH has created opportunities for undergraduates to share their research in a wide variety of humanities and social science disciplines and to learn from their peers. This spring, the College Academic Council faced the unique challenge of mounting CRUSH virtually. Luckily, our students rose to the occasion and submitted their research presentations via video, PowerPoints, and other forms of media. The CRUSH website can be found in the link in today's chat. And I encourage you to visit and view all of the presentations and enjoy all of our students' contributions to CRUSH this year. In addition, CRUSH has always included conversations with faculty about the research process, so we decided to create today's student research panel in webinar form, which will be recorded and the link placed within the CRUSH website. I'm grateful to today's panelists for joining us, and I'm pleased to introduce them now. Our faculty moderator is Coilin Parsons, Associate Professor in Georgetown College's Department of English. Our student panelists are Mayesha Awal, who graduated with Georgetown College's class of 2020 with a double major in government and psychology. Nick Giotis, a member of Georgetown College's class of 2023 with a double major in economics and theater and performance studies. Sonali Mirpuri, who graduated with Georgetown College's class of 2020 with a double major in government and history, and Rachel Singer, a member of Georgetown College's class of 2022 with a major in history. And now we'll hear from Professor Parsons.
Thank you, Dean Force, for introducing the panel, and thanks for everything you've done to make this possible. Hello, good afternoon from Washington, D.C., and welcome to this afternoon's seminar highlighting the outstanding undergraduate research taking place in the humanities and social sciences here at Georgetown College. Thanks for joining us online. It's a great pleasure for me to be part for the very first time of the exciting work of the College Academic Council and of this research colloquium. I'm going to turn it over to our student presenters as soon as possible, but I want to just draw your attention first of all to one thing. The Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions for our speakers, either individually or as a group, you can ask them using the Q&A feature. And I'll try and pick them up and ask them during a question and answer session we'll have at the end after all of the presentations. We'll hear from each of the presenters in turn, and then I'll ask a couple of questions after their presentations, and then there will be an open Q&A at the end. So please do make sure to use that Q&A feature. We're going to start first with Mayesha Awal, and her research question is, what is the association between the number of juvenile offences or the frequency and total community services ever utilised? And we'll see a video of her presentation just now.
Hi, my name is Mayesha, and I am a graduating senior at Georgetown University, double majoring in both psychology and government. My research is of my honors thesis, which looked at predicting procedural justice and legitimacy, youth mental health and wellness for serious juvenile offenders. In the United States, there were 728,000 juvenile arrests in 2018, and 25% of all serious violent crime involved a juvenile offender. The theory of procedural justice is defined by 1, the quality of decision-making by judges and police in the criminal justice system, which includes decisions that are transparent, unbiased, and factual-based, and 2, the quality of how the judges and police treat the juveniles. The theory of legitimacy is defined by the belief in whether or not judges and police in the criminal justice system deserve to be accepted. As a result, the juveniles' perceptions of the judges, police, and criminal justice system leads to whether or not they obey the law. According to these theories, people who view the justice system as more legitimate are more likely to cooperate with the legal system and obey the law, even when the outcomes are not favorable for them. Meet Jim, a juvenile who has low perceptions of procedural justice and legitimacy. He has committed a weapons offense, which is a serious violent crime. Jim believes that the judge and police disrespect him and do not ever listen to a word he says. From his childhood experience of his father going to prison, he believes that the judges discriminated against his father because of his age, as his father was young when he went to prison, and all judges hold similar prejudices as well. As a result, Jim doesn't believe his own trial was fair, and after completing his sentence, he continues to disobey the law and returns back to prison several times. He was referred to a counselor because of his drug addiction, but he also refused to ever go. Previous studies have not examined the total community services ever received, especially among serious juvenile offenders, which could be a crucial component of procedural justice and legitimacy. An example of community health services includes services like psychologist, counselor, social worker. Many juveniles are referred to community services in the court system, so this may be an important component of their relationship with the legal system. Studies have shown that if people use more community services, it may reduce how much they commit crimes, and it builds their trust, leading to greater perception of procedural justice in healthcare. But it is not known whether this would increase or decrease procedural justice and legitimacy in the legal system. First, access of community services may reduce crime. Goldstein found that when the number of treatment facilities increases, as a result, violent crimes decrease. Second, increased utilization of community services may lead to juveniles being more involved in the court system, as courts may provide health services to youth who are arrested more often. Third, the relationship may be neutral with no relationship at all. So, does the total number of community services that a youth receives predict procedural justice and legitimacy? We believe that community services predict procedural justice and legitimacy, but we do not have a direction of that effect. But we do believe that there is a significant association here. Although the study found no significant relationship for community health services ever received and procedural justice for both judges and police, there was a significant association for community health services and legitimacy. People who access communities to health services are far more likely to believe that the justice they receive is legitimate. Thus, it is important to support youth by cultivating trust in community services so that they have a greater perception of legitimacy.
Thanks, Mayesha. That's really fascinating and really important work. I'm an English professor, so I don't know how to do this kind of study. Could you tell me a little bit about how you actually undertook this study? Like, how, did you conduct interviews? Were there focus groups, or did you rely on other data? How do you find out how people relate to the justice system?
Yeah, so thanks for your question.
What I did a secondary data analysis, which means that I analyzed pre-existing data that was already collected before. The data itself was called the Pathways to Desistance Study, and it was created by Edward Mulvey and colleagues, and they collected the data from 2000 to 2010 of serious juvenile offenders in Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania, and Maricopa County, Arizona.
It's, I mean, even though you're relying on other people's data, it's obviously not an easy topic to research. Reading through these interviews and hearing about people's difficulties accessing justice and thinking about legitimacy, what was the hardest part for you in doing this research and reading about these stories?
For me, the most challenging part, it wasn't this, the data analysis was pretty seamless once I learned Stata and SPSS. But the challenging part was actually COVID-19, because I initially had a different topic of which was like whether gang membership predicts utilization of community services. But part of my data was restricted on a computer that didn't have internet access, which was located on campus. So I was unable to use that data. So once I was home, I had to completely change my topic in March and use only the public part of my data set.
That's very impressive. It doesn't look like that from this angle. Sounds like you've been working on this for a year. I've one last question before we move on to the next presentation. That is, you know, this is an unfair question because you just finished your senior thesis, but if you want to help a city like DC, say, to make someone like the person in your example, Jim, have increased confidence in the justice system and increased sense of the legitimacy of the justice system, what do you think the most important thing is that the city could do to increase perpetrators or offenders' sense of legitimacy of the justice system?
That's a good question. I would think that the most important thing for the city to have is training for law enforcement, like judges and police, while doing surveys alongside. So I would envision that the surveys would analyze how the system treats juveniles, and give surveys to the youth who were in court as well as the judges. And so from that survey data, the city should design the training program and see whether or not it increases youth's trust in the judges and police, as well as the criminal justice system as a whole. And so I think the training system should be really personalized, and it should affect other systems as well, like the community services that are offered to the youth from the system.
I hope you get a chance to put that into effect, and soon.
Hopefully someday.
We'll move on. We'll move on to the next presentation, which is from Nick Giotis, and Nick has a pithy short title. The title of the presentation is The Holistic National Progress Index. Thanks, Nick.
Hi there, my name is Nick Giotis. I'm a first-year student here at Georgetown University studying economics and theater and performance studies. And today, I will be talking about the culmination of 2 semesters of independent research and data analysis, the Holistic National Progress Index. The Holistic National Progress Index, or HNPI, is an alternative progress indicator designed to address the shortcomings of the United Nations Human Development Index. The Human Development Index is the most commonly cited measure of a country's overall commitment to human development, addressing not just economic growth and gross domestic product, but the comprehensive improvement of human capacity. In practice, though, the HDI faces 3 major issues in completing that goal. The first is a high correlation with GDP, the second is a lack of breadth in indices accounted for, and the third is the inability to represent improvement within already developed countries. The HNPI is designed to rectify these 3 problems and stand as a rival progress indicator. To address the issue of representing development, the HNPI employs a z-scoring system rather than the HDI's 0 to 1 scale for each index. This means that, rather than reaching an arbitrary ceiling for development, that is, finding it harder and harder to achieve the theoretical highest value of 1, a country's score is based on its comparison to its peers. A year one growth in overall life expectancy is valued the same no matter what your country's original life expectancy was. To address the other two problems, a similarity to GDP and a lack of holistic indices, the HNPI uses 8 indices as compared to 3, including domestic equality, sustainability, and global peace, all of which are less correlated with GDP. The correlation, caused by the HDI's choice in indices which are necessarily tied to economic stability, validates the sometimes questionable decisions made by developed countries while writing off the successes of developing ones. In this way, metrics such as peace and happiness serve to hold developed nations accountable while differentiating those states with room to grow. In practice, these steps to decouple a country's ranking from GDP in a meaningful way worked, and correlation between country ranks and GDP ranks fell from 0.95 to 0.82 when comparing the HDI and the HNPI. As an economics major with an interest in global equity economics, alternative progress indicators are a subject I find myself passionate about. The idea that economic growth is the end-all be-all way to quantify human progress seems so backwards to me, and the work done by the United Nations to address that was something I always thought as laudable. Halfway through my first semester, I decided to pursue this academic drive and talked to Professor Rogers in the economics department. Professor Rogers gave me a piece of advice. It doesn't matter how you do it, but how you do it has to matter. If the HDI is so great, why bother making a new one? It was Professor Rogers' advice that put the HNPI on its eventual track as a progress indicator intentionally designed to target and rectify the faults associated with the HDI. While figures for national GDP are readily available for countries from the Holy See to the United States, data for things like sustainability, happiness, and inequality are much less so. If the HNPI can bring even the smallest attention to these factors, the ones I believe are so vital to human development, its success will be immeasurable. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I suppose you probably didn't anticipate when you began this work just how timely it would be when we're in a situation in which the very question of economic growth versus human health seems to be among the most important things in the news. So I'm really interested in this idea of the Holistic National Progress Index. Well, first question, wait, what's the top country?
All right, so the top country, I'm going to pull up the data set here. The top country for the HNPI is, if I remember correctly, Norway? No, it's Denmark. Okay, so the top country is Denmark with a score of 142, which is 5 points higher than Iceland, and then following Iceland is Norway, Switzerland, Sweden, Finland. So those Scandinavian countries are the ones that fare best, largely because they are countries that do have high GDP, but also invest a lot in domestic controls such as social programs, the environment, and focus away from global conflict and things like that.
Yeah. So your HNPI, your Holistic National Progress Index, sounds a little bit like the so-called Happiness Index, where I think Bhutan is at the top of the Happiness Index. Where does Bhutan rank in your index, and how does your index differ from that kind of happiness index?
So Bhutan is actually a really, really interesting case for this, because one of the indices that I use for the HNPI is happiness, and Bhutan actually ranks relatively like middle of the race for happiness on the World Happiness Report, which is the index that I'm using for the HNPI. And the reason for that is largely because the World Happiness Report, it's developed by a UN group, and it draws from certain factors that also draw from GDP. So it has a category called dystopia, which is really confusing and hard to explain. GDP, social support, healthy life expectancy, freedom to make choices, generosity, and corruption, and rather perceptions of corruption. And so Bhutan, because it has a lower healthy life expectancy and a lower GDP, fares worse in the World Happiness Report. And in the HNPI, I actually removed the percentage of the happiness score explained by GDP, but the healthy life expectancy is the second most important index for the World Happiness Report. So Bhutan ranks pretty much middle of the pack both for the HNPI and the World Happiness Report, and I think that that's largely because the goalposts are in a certain place. But Bhutan does represent something really important, which is a country's government recognizing that human development is more so than just GDP. And in fact, Bhutan literally uses happiness as its metric for success. It's not just a byproduct of what they do, it is the target of what they do. And I think that's really important. And so I think in the future, there would be, if there's different ways to represent happiness that maybe does center less around GDP, because that's the whole purpose of this, is to decouple from GDP, then that's something I'm looking forward to.
Quick last question. You are an economics and a theater and performance major. Are there many of you that cross those two disciplines? And I guess, you know, what part do you think the arts have to play in your holistic national, I'm trying to remember, HNPI, your happiness index? What part do you think the arts and theater have to play in that?
Well, so to answer your first question, we are a small bunch, but there is one or two of us. And I think it's a really important cross-discipline, and I think that this is somewhere that it's very much comes into play. So I don't know if there's really a numerical way to represent how the arts functions into global development, but I do believe that human development is development of the arts in a way, because looking at theater as a mode of storytelling and a mode of preserving history, you start to realize that writing and theater and painting is the story of humans. And I think that when you can start to think about preserving human history and also thinking of humans as a timeline of essentially evolution, both literal and kind of more functionally, then you start to realize that the arts are a mode of storytelling and a mode of preservation. And I think those two functions mean that they are always important and always a part of development and not just a part of humanity in some nebulous way.
Yeah, very good. As an English professor, that makes me very happy to hear that. We'll move on. Thanks so much, Nick. We'll move on to Rachel Singer, who has a title with some very complicated words that I am able to pronounce because her work touches on Irish influences in Icelandic sagas. So the title is Carol Muirchertach and the Small Gravel Hillock, the puzzle of Irish influence in the Laxdaela saga. Thanks, Rachel.
Hello, my name is Rachel Singer. I am a current sophomore in the college studying history, medieval studies, and linguistics. And today I'm going to talk about Irish literary influences in an Icelandic saga. Now, Iceland, as any of you who's been there certainly knows, is very unique. But it also had a lot of contacts with Northern Europe in the early Middle Ages, and that is really reflected in its literature. So I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of the genre of Icelandic sagas and about what's so special about the one I just studied. And then I'll go over my methodology and findings. So the Icelandic sagas are a group of prose texts written about Vikings by the descendants of Vikings about 400 years after the events they relate happened. And they're very, very interesting to read. They're full of blood feud and complex legal cases. And they're also surprisingly psychologically complex for medieval literature. And as a result, they're totally unique. Now, even though the events they relate, for the most part, actually happened, they were recorded so much later and embellished to be literary in a way that makes them not the most reliable of sources about exactly what happened. But they really do straddle the line between history and literature in a very interesting way. Now, the saga that I looked at is called Laxdaela Saga, and it tells the story of a family throughout several generations and most famously relates a tragic love triangle. But interestingly, it's also by far the most Irish influenced of the Icelandic sagas. There are a handful of Irish characters, most notably Princess Melkorka, who is abducted from Ireland and sold as a slave in Iceland. There are also Irish literary motifs, but these motifs appear in different parts of the saga from the Irish characters. So it's really the saga itself that's Irish. But at the same time, it's overwhelmingly Norse. The Irish characters don't act any differently from the Norse ones. They don't have unique customs, they don't speak Irish, and they don't have their own material culture. So I really wanted to look into this paradox of similarity and difference. And I did that by comparing the Irish literary devices to actual Irish texts and also to other places they could have come from. But I concluded ultimately that this most likely was the case of Irish literary transmission. And I also looked at the linguistic roots of the Irish characters' names, where I found that the kings were actually corruptions of the names of real Irish kings, but that this central character, Melchorca, has a Norse name. It actually means small gravel hillock. And I thought that was very interesting because in her case, even her name is Norse. And then I also did a close reading of the saga for material culture to see if there were different objects used by Irish characters than Norse ones, but that didn't seem to be the case. And this points in a number of interesting directions. This research could be used to support the theory that some scholars have that Laxdaela Saga was written by a woman. There are several characteristics of it that have made people think that. And genetic studies show that the female ancestry of Icelanders is mostly Celtic because of these slave women like Melchorca. So the centrality of her story in this saga shows a concern for a part of history that women may have been more cognizant of, and that could be used to support female authorship, especially because the Irish literary elements appear in parts of the sagas where there are no Irish characters, which implies to me that there's something Irish about the saga and not just about its characters. It's also possible to use this to support the idea that Vikings saw the Irish as being quite similar to themselves because the Irish characters behave as Norsemen and use Norse tools, and in one case even have a Norse name. There was a lot of cultural contact between North World and Ireland because Vikings conquered quite a large part of the island and established the city of Dublin before later being driven back out. This could mean that the cultural contact between the Vikings and the Irish led the Vikings at least not to see the Irish as being very different. But above all, this emphasizes that Norse contact with the wider world was not limited to conquest. We tend to think of Vikings as mindless killing machines, but this shows that there was absolutely more than just that going on. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rachel. This is really fascinating work. And I guess I have one simple question, which is, what language are these sagas written in? And did you get to work at all with the original language? How do you access them?
So they're written in Old Norse, which is the ancestor language of all of the Scandinavian languages and is closer to modern Icelandic than Shakespeare is to modern English. So Icelanders still have a lot of cultural contact with these texts because they can read them so easily, even though they were written so long ago. At the time I wrote this, I did not read Old Norse, but learning it has actually become one of my quarantine projects. So I'm actually working on getting to the point where I can engage with these original texts. There are a lot of very good translations out there.
And where, how are they recorded? You say they're recorded, they're written down potentially 300, 400, even 500 years after the events. How are they recorded, and where would I go if I wanted to see an Old Norse manuscript or a manuscript of an Icelandic saga? I assume that, again, because of COVID, you were unable to get your hands on these, but if you wanted to, where would you go?
So they're almost all in Iceland. They all spent a lot of time in Denmark because there's this very famous collection of manuscripts at a museum there, but in the 1970s, Iceland got a lot of them back. This particular saga is one of the most popular, so it survives in an awful lot of manuscripts. But Icelanders also have a tradition of copying down stories that they find really moving or meaningful. And because this is one of the most emotionally complex of the sagas, it's also just copied down in a bunch of people's houses throughout the generations.
Great, so we can find these stories anywhere, we just have to go to Iceland.
basically.
We'll move on, keeping an eye on time. We'll move on to Sonali Mirpuri, who's our final presenter. And of course, I'll say last but not least. That's what we have to say. And this is a fascinating project that is based a few hundred meters from where I am in DC. And I love that Sonali has been working with, as part of sort of Georgetown in DC and the DC in Georgetown. You'll hear more about this from Sonali's presentation. So the title is The Microhistory of the Ben Ali Family, a story of identity formation and negotiation in Washington, DC. Thanks, Sonali.
Hi, my name is Sonali Mirpuri, and I'm a current senior in the Georgetown College, majoring in government and history with a minor in education, inquiry, and justice. For my senior history thesis project, I conducted a microhistory of the Ben Ali family, a story of identity formation and negotiation in Washington, D.C. My thesis adopts a microhistory format where I outline the complex narrative surrounding Ben and his family. This format allows us to analyze his life based on historical moments that activated each of his identities. In viewing this in-depth analysis of his life, we can observe intergenerational changes within his family and Washington, D.C. as a whole. My thesis research was supplemented through oral history interviews with his wife, Virginia, 2 of his 3 sons, Sage and Kamal, and 1 of his 3 daughters-in-law, Vida. I also utilized primary source materials from the GW Special Collections Archive on Ben's Chili Bowl. My research was also advised by Professor Ananya Chakrabarti in the Department of History, as well as Professor Allison Games, who ran the Senior History Thesis Seminar. My thesis is divided into 3 different chapters. The first is Building Ben in Trinidad, where I contextualize his childhood and how his time in Trinidad served him as he immigrated to the United States. Forced into indentured labor, Ben's maternal grandparents arrived from India to Trinidad. Here, they embedded themselves in a growing Indo-Trinidadian Muslim community. Ben was born in San Juan, Trinidad and Tobago, in June 1927. He gained exposure to Indian culture, Islam, and colonized ideations of Blackness. Then he immigrated to the United States in 1945 under a student visa. After transferring from different universities in Lincoln, Nebraska, and Scranton, Pennsylvania, he eventually earned a degree from Howard University in 1950. With this establishment in DC, my second chapter then analyzes Ben on U Street. In October of 1958, Ben married Virginia Rollins, a Catholic woman. However, in order to get married, Virginia had to convert to Islam. The inception of Ben's Chili Bowl became a symbol of his overlapping identities. U Street embedded Ben in Blackness, especially as the Chili Bowl became a staple in the Black neighborhood and a representation of Black Washington. All this while, he maintained the outward practice of Islam and his ties to the Indo-Trinidadian community. In this chapter, you really see the confluence of all his identities and how he practiced them in different ways. My third chapter then goes into building Ben through family and how the second generation constructs identity. Currently, Ben and Virginia's 3 sons, Sage, Kamal, and Nizam, operate the business. Through remembrance, Ben's identity is constructed through the stories of his sons and daughter-in-law. His identity thus evolves through the legacy of his children's choices. Each of his children decided to embed themselves within one of Ben's differing identities. So then, through their stories, you can extrapolate how they remembered Ben and thus ascribed him his own identity. My microhistory results then illustrate the fluidity and dynamism of identity as a whole. Constantly in motion, identity cannot hold true to one form. We all embody multiple identities which are activated in different historical contexts. This thesis then conceptualizes identity as something that is socially constructed and historically maintained. Throughout this whole research process, I was really able to reflect on my own identity and really examine the multiplicity that we all hold and how we all exist in varying levels of identity. So that was something that was really surprising to me. And as a South Asian woman myself, I was really able to delve into my own identity and realize the differing of experiences and how not only can we ascribe something to ourselves, but how others prescribe something to us. So thank you so much for listening. and I really look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Sonali. That's great. I guess my first question is a question that's probably on the lips of every single person based in DC when they look at a presentation or when they listen to a presentation like this. U Street, where Ben's Chili Bowl is, has changed so much in the past 10 years with massive gentrification all around it. What impact has this had on Ben's Chili Bowl and on the Ben Ali family?
I think one of the things that makes Ben's Chili Bowl really special is its endurance and resilience throughout different decades that it's been placed in U Street. So now with the decade-long process of gentrification that's been occurring, one of the things that at least I've noticed Ben's doing is capitalizing on its rich history. So it's really using how its role in the community to then ascribe a sense of stability to the Black community within U Street and be a beacon for that group of people.
And so right now, I think like every business in DC, but I've seen in the Washington Post recently that Ben's Chili Bowl is under severe pressure because of COVID. What's happening to the family right now? Have you spoken to them recently or spoken to them since this started? And what does the future of Ben's Chili Bowl look like?
So as with all minority-owned small businesses right now, they're all very going through a lot of struggle. Ben's went through a whole phase where they were kind of in limbo of getting the PPP grant, which is for small businesses. They eventually got approved. So for them, I have talked to them recently, but not with the past few weeks after graduation, but they have mentioned that no matter what, the U Street location will not close because that is what started the whole Ben's Chili Bowl franchise at this point now. But no matter what, that U Street location means so much to the community, so they will do everything in their power to keep that one open. And they're really using their place as one of the most renowned small businesses to kind of be a voice for other ones during this very trying time. So it's actually really special, all the articles that have been written about them and how they're being an advocate for the community.
Yeah, it's a very special place in DC. I have one last quick question before we go to a couple of larger questions. I think both your supervisors, Professor Chakrabarty and Professor Gaines, are early modern historians. So they talk about something that happened hundreds of years ago. But yours is about something that's been happening over the last 50 years and right now. What was the hardest part about constructing a historical project about, in a sense, the present?
I feel like it was also simultaneously the hardest thing I've done as well as the best thing I've done, because I feel when you're doing a history of the present, there's so many interpretations that same history can take. So the most challenging part was the conflicting narratives I would hear and having to parse through that. But it was also the most interesting thing. I feel like I got so many different versions of one story, and it was how do these stories all link together to create one cohesive narrative? But since it's a history of the present, my history is not the end all be all. It is one version of something that's currently going on, which is what makes it special in my opinion.
Great. We have a couple of questions that have come through on the Q&A, so thanks especially to those who are listening. The first one is particularly for Rachel, and it's from Brandon. Brandon asks, do you think the relationship between these sagas could have gone the other way? In fact, is there a Norse cultural, are there Norse cultural influences on Irish legends like Cuchulainn?
Absolutely. Historians and literary specialists tend to look at Norse, Celtic, and Anglo-Saxon cultures as a unit because they have a very similar set of heroic values that comes across in their literature. There's a lot in common between the world we see in Beowulf and the worlds we see in Irish mythology and the Welsh Mabinogi and in these Icelandic sagas. So there was definitely a whole North Sea world going on that the Viking raiding and trading really helped to facilitate, and cultural contacts were going in all directions.
Yeah, in fact, many of the words in Gaelic having to do with trade and ship making and ships are actually borrowings from Old Norse. There's another question which is for Mayesha and Nick together, and it's from Dean Bernie Cook. Both of your presentations, Mayesha and Nick, engage with the social impact of perceptions. Like, it matters what people think about things and how we help them think in different ways. What do you think each approach, so Mayesha from the community-based approach and Nick's from the sort of macro attention to big questions like nation states, how do you think these approaches might actually offer something to each other in terms of sort of rethinking perceptions?
I guess I'll start from the how small scale micro thinking can affect the macro approach. And I think that the easy answer is to say, well, of course, the human development is about humans. It's in the name. And so, like, any of the indices, especially the ones that I use in the HNPI, which are happiness, equality, even sustainability, are ones that start from a single person and grow. And I think that that's really important. But I also think the idea of perception is really interesting because, like, the way that human beings in a nation state understand each other affects their relationships, and those relationships then grow into greater inequality between social groups, and they grow into a greater misunderstanding of how we treat the environment, and a greater misunderstanding of what it means to go out without a mask, and who you're putting at risk when you as an individual don't want to wear a mask. And so I think that health and education and everything that the HNPI talks about is necessarily tied to human beings, because that's what it all is.
Thanks,
Mayesha?
Nick. Oh, yeah. So for me, the juvenile justice system isn't one system. It spans throughout different states, localities, counties. And so to focus on to focus on two counties, it also reflects upon, what other systems can, how the juveniles are affected there. So, for instance, like perceptions of trust and perceptions of trust in authorities is universal, and that also affects other juveniles as well. So by focusing on two systems, it can give us more information about or raise other questions about what other juveniles in other systems of the United States may feel as well, especially since we have the largest prison system in the whole world.
Very good. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I realize we're running close to the end, but I'm going to use Chair's prerogative and ask one large question that I think any of your undergraduate peers might be thinking about as they undertake research themselves. Well, let me ask two questions, and each one of you can answer. The first is, what do you plan to do with this? What's the next step? And the second is, do you have any particular advice that you would offer to your fellow students who want to undertake research? Rachel, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure thing. So my next steps are to learn more of these North Sea languages so that I can do this sort of textual analysis with the original manuscripts, and that just removes a lot of margin for error. There's no way to translate anything without losing something, so it's always good to have the original. And my main piece of advice to other researchers would be to ask for help, because we have wonderful professors at Georgetown, all of whom are professional researchers, and they're always there to point you in the right direction and to tell you when your conclusions are overreaching.
Very good. Mayesha.
So in the future, I'm hoping to publish my thesis project, if possible. And I have two big pieces of advice. Like, my first advice is I would recommend starting early. For me, that was one of my things when I look back and reflect, it really helped me in the long run because of the COVID-19 situation. So you never really know the obstacles that can come your way. So that's my number one piece of advice. And then my number two advice is do something that you're really interested in, because researching is a very thorough project.
Yeah, very good. Nick?
As the youngest person on the panel and also just a first year in general, I genuinely don't know where to go from here, because I have something that I worked on pretty independently, I would say, and not for a class, not for anything like that. So, I think that that's kind of the question that I'm grappling with, which is like, what do I do with this? Because I love it and I'm proud of it. And I think it's something that could be really useful, but I'm not sure. And I think that bleeds into an advice that I need to take, which is the same advice that Mayesha said, which was just to reach out to people. And I think that that's something that I don't do enough. But if there's one thing that I can say as somebody who did it, it's just to do it. Like I was for the play that we were doing, an acorn, which is, I have it, the poster right there. You can't see it because there's a light on. I was assistant directing, and for a lot of the rehearsals, I would just sit there and delete data and sift through data, and I just did it. And I think just forcing yourself to sink more time into it, and every day you wake up and you're like, gosh, I wasted 2 more hours on it, I have to keep going, is the best motivation. So that's where I come from.
It's like the best waste of time. And Sonali?
I hope for me that I can make my research more readily available. There is an archive for Ben's Cearbhall that I use to gain most of the primary sources. So I'm hoping to include it in the archive at GW, as well as make it available for a diasporic studies, because a lot of my thesis talks about the South Asian diaspora. So kind of introducing it to different archival websites and reaching out there. So now it's like the whole second process of like doing that part. But my main piece of advice, I would say, is patience, because I know that for me, I get frustrated pretty easily. So when I had all these different narratives and I had a lot of scheduling conflicts with everyone I was interviewing, it took a lot for me to like realize that everyone like has their own method of working, and I had to readjust mine. So a lot of it is patience and knowing that like it'll end up happening. You just have to like go through the process of it.
Yeah. And I think what will also end up happening is that people will use your research. There is huge interest in Ben's Cearbhall, and I think the South Asian aspect and the Caribbean aspect of the history of Ben's Cearbhall is probably not understood very well in DC. So it's great to see that and to think about it as these so many identities coming together in that one place. I want to thank you all for giving us an extraordinary flavor of the broad range of methodologies, from data to interviews, to reading texts, and exciting range of questions in research in the humanities and social sciences that are, and giving us a flavor of all of this research that's underway among our undergraduates here at Georgetown. And remember, if you want to learn about all of the projects in this colloquium on research in the social sciences, Erin has shared the website in the chat feature, and I think we'll share it again just now. So let me wrap up by thanking the College Academic Council for its support of undergraduate research. That is incredibly important. By thanking all of your advisors for helping you through this. And thanks to you, our audience online, but most of all, and especially, thanks to Erin for putting this together, for helping us bring this together, but to Mayesha, to Nick, to Sonali, and to Rachel for this fascinating look into your research. It's been a pleasure to listen to these and to have a conversation with you. Thank you.